I'm Catherine McGrady, the CEO of CNA, and this is CNA Talks. In this podcast, our experts discuss current events, policies, and research that impact our nation's security.
This is CNA Talks, episode 110. I'm John Stimpson with CNA's Office of Communications. Today, we are continuing our conversation about China's economic activity in the Arctic. In this episode, how the Arctic fits into their global strategy. Well, I'm privileged to have two great CNA analysts with me to discuss the issue of China's objectives in the Arctic region. First, Heidi Holz. She's a research scientist with CNA's China Studies program. Welcome back to the podcast, Heidi.
It's a pleasure to be on again. Looking forward to discussing this topic with you today.
And making his long-awaited return, we have Andrew Taffer. He is a research scientist in CNA's Indo-Pacific Security Affairs program. Andrew, it's great to have you back.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you.
So we having you guys on today as a part 2 of our ongoing series about China's presence in the Arctic, including their foreign direct investment. Just a note to the listeners, in this conversation, we'll be using China and the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, interchangeably. So those all mean the same thing for our purposes. So I'll just start off with the obvious first question. Why is China even engaged in the Arctic at all? They're not an Arctic state. What has motivated them to engage in that region?
Beijing has been loud and clear about the fact that it has strategic interests in the Arctic. And these interests really go back to the fact that Beijing sees the Arctic region as really important to achieving their strategic vision for China, which they call the China dream of national rejuvenation. And in that dream, China's returned to its former glory as a political, cultural, and economic power. All these things that China's leaders feel were stripped from them during the century of humiliation at the hands of imperialist powers. And where does the Arctic fit in that? PRC leaders see the Arctic as important to building what they refer to as the community with a shared future for mankind. And that's the slogan that they use to describe an international system that's been restructured in ways that suit China's interests and give it a seat at the table.
So in a sense, moving away from the American-led order towards perhaps more of a China-led order.
Exactly. One word in which they have a leading role. But you were correct in pointing out that China's not an Arctic state. So they've kind of had to work a bit to justify or legitimize their interest in having that seat at the table in Arctic affairs. And that's where they come up with this term, you may have heard it, near Arctic state, to describe China.
And I have to just say, and this is just a me thing, and maybe I'm the only one with this problem, but I keep finding myself using that term to describe actual Arctic states. In my mind, something like the United States borders the Arctic, but it's not like it's centered in the Arctic. It's not like the entire country is in the Arctic. And so, I don't know, I guess I just find it to be a pretty effective propaganda term in the sense that it does a good job of tricking you into thinking, oh, near Arctic, that makes sense.
At first blush, I heard it and I thought, you're working really hard to come up with a way to justify your presence, China. But as you point out, it is a way to shape the discourse, right? What is an Arctic state? How much territory do you have to have in the Arctic to be considered an Arctic state? Well, at least the United States has some. China doesn't have any.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Andrew, anything to add to this?
I think Heidi is right to begin answering your question about China's or Xi Jinping's strategic objectives in the grandest sort of sense. As we note in the report, China, certainly Xi Jinping, but probably even before Xi Jinping, had these aspirations to return to what it views as its rightful place in the international order as a major power. And the Arctic is a kind of a unique region, an important region for a number of reasons that we lay out in the report. And I think that one thing to maybe keep in mind here is that for a state that aspires to great power status, the Arctic is a region where it needs to have a presence, or at least it believes it needs to have a presence and influence in Arctic affairs. Perhaps it can't be the kind of the great power that it wants to be or that it believes that it should be without being an Arctic great power. Xi Jinping himself has said that China should be an Arctic power. So I wonder if kind of productive to view the Arctic and to view Chinese influence in the Arctic as kind of a necessary condition for China to become a great power in general.
Something Andrew just said is a really good point. China's interest in the Arctic isn't new, and their interest in restoring themselves, the China dream of national rejuvenation isn't something new. But China's activities in the Arctic go back decades, particularly their effort to establish a scientific presence there and building scientific research stations.
So would it be fair to say as well that part of China's interest in the region is that most of the other states that we would consider to be great powers on a global sense, that being the United States, Russia, and the European Union, which I recognize is a little bit more of a nebulous term, but in a lot of ways it does function as a single economy, have access to the Arctic region. And China feels like if it doesn't have that access, it will be left behind.
Yeah, that's accurate. And they're looking ahead, and the ways that China sees the Arctic as playing a role in the China dream, one key way is by helping to sustain China's economic development. And there are resources in the Arctic that they see as really critical to that. And then looking ahead, they see the potential for shipping routes to open up, which is not only helpful to sustaining China's economic development, there's also a national security interest in terms of the fact that those shipping lanes would open up an alternative to choke points, to the strategic choke points like the Strait of Malacca or the Panama Canal that China worries about. So, those are just a couple of reasons that they see the Arctic as very important, and they want a seat at the table in making decisions about that region.
Well, let's get into that because, as you kind of alluded to in that answer, your report lays out 3 goals that China has in the Arctic. And as you just said, the first one is sustaining economic development. Beyond what you just mentioned, the importance of shipping lanes, the natural resources in the region, is there anything else you'd like to add to that point?
They hope to develop the shipping lanes. They're looking to conduct scientific research there. As I mentioned, there's the security dimension. Although to date, China hasn't had much of a military presence in the Arctic, at least not visibly. I think there's only been a couple of naval ship visits in the region. But Chinese military writers write about the strategic value of the Arctic, particularly of deploying nuclear submarines there. They describe it as a strategic commanding heights because of the potential range of missiles fired from boomers or from nuclear submarines in the Arctic.
So I had intended to discuss their 3 goals in the Arctic, which in your paper you outline as sustaining economic development, defending national sovereignty, security, and development interests, and reforming the global system to align with PRC interests as separate topics. But hearing you describe this, Heidi, in that last answer, it seems like these 3 ideas are inextricably linked to each other, and in some senses, accomplishing one of them simultaneously accomplishes other ones. To tap into the answer you just provided there, being able to use the Arctic as a shipping lane also would mean that their military could access the region. And finally, reforming the global system to align with PRC interests, that goal just being so encompassing of this economic power and military power, anything that increases China's flexibility, anything that increases China's access to the global markets and to global shipping lanes simultaneously accomplishes that goal.
That's right, John. They're very interrelated. It's hard to separate them out. A really good example of that, you mentioned the shipping lanes and developing shipping lanes. Well, take that a step further. You have to develop infrastructure along the Arctic to do that, and port access in order to have sustainable commercial routes to the Arctic. And you could, in theory, make those ports dual use. You could be establishing the infrastructure necessary for commercial ships as well as military ships to operate in the region. So that's just one example of how, inextricably linked the achievement of these objectives all are.
And that's not entirely dissimilar to the PRC's strategy in the Indian Ocean and Middle East, where they're investing in port infrastructure there, in a lot of cases through foreign direct investment. But there is a lot of speculation that that foreign direct investment could be used as a coercion method and a way to access these ports for military purposes as well as economic ones.
Exactly. The tools that Beijing, China use to achieve their objectives in the Arctic it's the same set of tools, it's the same playbook that they operate from elsewhere. One thing kind of unique about the Arctic region is because China's not really an Arctic state and they don't have direct access to the Arctic, they really rely heavily on the diplomatic and economic dimensions of state power. I mean, essentially, they're trying to buy access.
We've seen this in other parts of the world as well. I remember one of your colleagues recently wrote a piece for us on CNA In Depth, which we'll include in the description of this podcast, about a foreign direct investment project that would have given access to the PRC in the Panama Canal, but ultimately the project failed. But just to point out that it fits into this larger strategy as we've been discussing.
Yep, exactly. This is something that we see Beijing use. We call it economic statecraft, but we see them use that all over the world. That Panama example is one, and of course there are many in the Arctic region as well.
I think one of the points that we try to make in the report and that you guys have been touching on is that the approach to the Arctic and other regions is one of civil military fusion, to use the Chinese term, right? And shipping infrastructure would be an example of it, having both civilian and a potentially military dimension or application. I would say scientific research would be the same. And again, we see like how interconnected all of these ways that China pursues its interests in the Arctic are. So for scientific research, right, there's kind of more of a benign element, examining like the effects of climate change, meteorology, marine chemistry, marine biology. There's also certainly a dual use capability here, right, in terms of mapping the ocean floor for potentially in the future for PRC submarines, and then also ground satellite stations in the Arctic that are kind of fundamentally dual use.
This is something that has not escaped the notice of the Arctic countries in which China is trying to invest or gain a footprint. And for that reason, you've seen some pushback among Arctic states based on security concerns. So, about 6 years ago, PRC firm attempted to buy an abandoned naval base in Greenland. Danish authorities thought that might pose a security concern and rejected the proposal. I think the U.S. might have voiced some concerns in that instance as well.
During the last episode we had with Cornell and Rebecca, we spoke about the screening mechanisms in place in the United States and Canada in particular have been very effective tools at preventing Chinese foreign direct investment projects that could be a threat to national security. And they mentioned that Greenland is sort of the weakest link in that chain, but it is good to see in the case of a military investment, the mechanisms that the Danish and Greenland authorities have in place are strong enough to limit that kind of action.
Well, since you all discussed the investment screening practices that Arctic countries, as opposed to China, have in place to protect their interests, the other side of the coin that many may not be aware of is that the PRC has investment screening practices or regulations that govern the overseas activities of Chinese companies. They do this through a system of party control, but also laws and regulations to ensure that investments by Chinese companies overseas are in line with China's strategic interests. But those regulations and mechanisms that the Chinese government has for governing PRC companies go beyond just the state-owned enterprises. That's something else that not everyone may be aware of, is that Beijing has levers for controlling privately owned PRC companies as well, to ensure that their activities are in line with, or at very least don't contradict, national level goals.
Why don't we take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll finish up our conversation.
Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Schroden. I direct CNA's Countering Threats and Challenges program, which helps the U.S. government better understand and counter state and non-state threats to U.S. national security. Analysts from my program understand these issues deeply because they've conducted fieldwork or provided on-site, real-time analytic support to U.S. government leaders in over 40 countries during the past 3 years. To learn more about how we can help you, please contact me directly at jonathan.schroeden@cna.org.
So, Andrew, there's been a lot of discussion recently about the February 2022 agreement between China and Russia. With that in mind, one would imagine that if China were to have success within any country for these foreign direct investment projects in the Arctic, it would be Russia. Can you speak a little bit about how things have gone there and, what their success has been in terms of investing in the Russian Arctic?
So I think you're right. I think among the Arctic states, China's had probably the most success in investing in Russia and developing a presence in the Russian far north. And I might point to what happened after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, which was sanctioned by the West. Russia had fewer economic and financial and diplomatic alternatives, although not beginning in 2014, certainly accelerating around 2014, deepened Russia's partnership with China. Russian alienation from the international community has increased by several orders of magnitude since the Ukraine war has broke out. So we might expect that faced with fewer economic, financial, and diplomatic friends outside, the Russians will find themselves moving closer and closer to China, and China would be in a position potentially to take advantage of Russia's isolation to expand its presence in the Russian Arctic.
I would agree with that. And that's something that has been on my mind is how the situation might change following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And Andrew's right. Due to international sanctions on Russia, you're likely to see intensification of Russia's reliance on China for investment. And I suspect Beijing will be willing to take advantage of that opportunity because even though prior to the invasion of Ukraine, China had been relatively more successful in its investments in Russia than elsewhere in the Arctic, but it hadn't necessarily been as successful as it would have liked. China promotes the development of shipping infrastructure along the Northern Sea Route under the banner of the Polar Silk Road. And that's this Chinese term to describe developing infrastructure that's along Russia's coast. And that didn't sit well politically, domestically within Russia. And there had been some domestic political pushback against that, particularly against calling it by this Chinese term, deeming those projects to be part of a larger Chinese project.
I mean, it's kind of like if the U.S. had called the Marshall Plan Manifest Destiny.
Yeah, it just doesn't sit well or play well to a Russian political audience, right? But that said, and this is the point I was working towards, is one of the things that China really wants is port access in the Arctic, and they still don't have it. They've been working on building a port in Arkhangelsk for years, and it keeps stalling. So whether that project starts to move forward might be an indicator of what we'll see in the future in terms of China's efforts to further its goals in the Russian Arctic.
I think Heidi's right on. The Russians are attracted to Chinese development finance in the Arctic to develop the Northern Sea Route, which is a priority for the Russian state. However, they're deeply ambivalent about a greater Chinese presence in the region. There's kind of a tension in Russia's calculation between wanting to access and exploit Chinese capital to develop a region that they've long sought to develop and inadvertently facilitating or expanding Chinese presence in the region that would not necessarily accord with Russian interests. There's reports from 2010, 2011, 2012 where Russian officials have expressed concern about Chinese research ships navigating and performing experiments in certain areas of the Northern Sea Route and had indeed forbidden these Chinese research ships from doing certain things in certain parts of the Northern Sea Route. And so there's tension.
That's all very interesting. I mean, it does just, at the end of the day, speak to the fact that, these agreements and cooperation is all good on paper, but at the end of the day, countries are the most invested in their own national interests. And there are limits to how much these kind of cooperations can function, especially when China is broadcasting so publicly that the goals of this development is about advancing its own power more so than anything else. All right, well, Heidi and Andrew, we are out of time, but thank you both so much for coming on. It's been a great conversation.
It's been our pleasure, John. Thank you so much for having us. Andrew, great to talk to you again as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Heidi. Thanks, John, for having us. And
the report is exploring the relationship between China's investment in the Arctic and its national strategy. We'll have the link to that available in our show notes, as well as a link to the program pages for Andrew and Heidi. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time on CNA Talks. Thanks for listening to CNA Talks. The views expressed are those of the commentators and do not necessarily reflect those of CNA or any of its sponsors. CNA Talks is produced, edited, and mixed by John Stimpson. Our theme music is by Edward Gringa. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.